Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Maybe you've had a long day, or maybe you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to gentle thoughts and quiet histories rather than counting sheep. Either way, this journey is for you. You've got nothing to do but rest. Let your mind relax, your breathing slow, and your body grow light as if gravity itself has softened. Because tonight we're drifting through the Old West. Not the mythical one of tall tales and exaggeration, but the real one. The one that existed at the turn of the 20th century, when the frontier was fading and the modern world was slowly creeping in. We're going to explore how a video game captured that world with remarkable care and attention. Red Dead Redemption 2, a game set in 1899, recreated an era that most of us have only seen in sepia photographs and dusty museum exhibits. And as you settle in tonight, we'll wander through that world together, discovering just how much of it was real. Let your eyes grow heavy if they want to. There's no test at the end of this. Just stories, just history, just the quiet comfort of learning something new as you drift towards sleep. The year is 1899, and the Old West is dying. That's not just a dramatic statement for a video game, it's historical fact. By the end of the 19th century, the American frontier had reached its limits. The 1890 census revealed something that changed how Americans thought about their country. There was no more frontier to conquer. The wild, untamed spaces that had defined the nation's expansion were filling up with towns, railroads, and laws. A historian named Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the frontier had officially ended by 1893. He believed that westward expansion had shaped the American character, and now that chapter was closing. But other historians suggest the Old West lingered just a bit longer. Perhaps until the 1910s, when Arizona became a state and the world turned its attention to the coming war in Europe. So when the game tells you that the age of outlaws and gunslingers was ending, it's telling you the truth. The Van der Linde gang, fleeing through the mountains in that opening chapter, are relics of a dying age. They just don't fully realise it yet. And speaking of those gangs, let your mind wander to the real outlaws of that era. The game's fictional Van der Linde gang mirrors the fate of so many real criminal organisations of the time. The Alvord Stiles gang formed in 1899, the very year the game begins, and ended when one of its leaders was captured in Mexico in 1904. The Chacon gang, a dangerous group that terrorised the Southwest starting around 1890, was finally stopped when their leader was hanged in 1902. The Ketchum gang lasted only 3 years before its members were captured or executed. Few gangs survived very far into the 20th century. The law was catching up, civilization was spreading, and the wild spaces where outlaws could hide were shrinking every year. As you breathe slowly and let your muscles relax, consider how strange it must have felt to be one of those outlaws, watching the world change around you, knowing that your way of life was becoming impossible. The gang travels through snow-covered mountains in those early hours of the game, and the state they're crossing through, Ambarino, feels like it could be anywhere in the Rockies. But there are clues that point toward Colorado. The geography matches sitting near the game's versions of New Mexico and Texas. The name itself is a hint. In Spanish, Colorado means reddish or red-coloured, while Ambarino means amber. Even the state flag in the game bears a resemblance to Colorado's flag from around 1907 to 1911. And that snowstorm that traps them in the mountains? Hosea complains about it, confused that such weather would hit in May. But snowstorms in the Colorado valleys were actually quite common in May, even if 1899 itself was relatively mild. There was at least one recorded snowstorm in northern Colorado that May, forcing a baseball game to be postponed. Perhaps not severe enough to trap a gang of outlaws, but notable nonetheless. The blizzard in the game may have been inspired by something more dramatic. The Great Blizzard of February 1899, which brought record-breaking cold to much of the country. Montana saw temperatures drop to negative 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice flowed down the Mississippi River past New Orleans. More than 100 people died. It was the kind of weather event that would have been fresh in everyone's memory as spring arrived. The gang eventually finds shelter in Coulter, an abandoned mining town. And here the game touches on another piece of real history. Mining towns rose and fell across the West like waves on a shore. The California gold rush of 1848 started it all, and when California's resources began to dwindle in the 1860s, prospectors moved toward the mountains. Colorado experienced an enormous boom after silver was discovered at Leadville in 1879. But then came 1893 and the price of silver collapsed. Depression followed. Mining towns were abandoned by the hundreds. By the 1990s, surveys identified more than 18,000 abandoned mines in Colorado alone. Ghost towns dotted the landscape, their wooden buildings slowly returning to the earth. In the game, Coulter was abandoned because of heavy snow rather than economic collapse, and that too has historical parallels. In December 1883, an avalanche swept over a boarding house for the Virginius mine outside Ouray, Colorado, killing at least 6 people. In that same year, a 23-day blizzard buried the mining town of Animas Forks under 25 feet of snow, forcing residents to dig tunnels just to move between buildings. Animas Forks survived that blizzard, but not forever. The mill ceased operation in 1910. By the 1920s it was a ghost town. 100 years later, it still is. As you drift deeper into relaxation tonight, imagine those empty streets, the wind whistling through broken windows, snow piling against doorways that no one will ever open again. The details in those early missions are remarkably accurate. The gang uses fuel-burning lanterns to light their way through the darkness, and these kerosene lamps were invented in 1853, replacing the older whale oil lanterns of the previous century. When Davy dies, the gang places coins over his eyes, a tradition that many believe dates back to ancient Greece but was actually more of a practical measure in places like Ireland and Scotland, used to keep the eyes from springing open due to muscular contraction. The tradition made its way to the Old West, and it's especially fitting that the Van der Linde gang would practice it, given Molly and Sean's Irish heritage. When Arthur, Dutch and Micah ride to the Adler Ranch, they tie their horses to hitching posts. These were the parking spaces of the 19th century, likely originating in Europe in the 1600s and becoming ubiquitous in America by the end of the 1800s. The first patent for a hitching post was issued in 1861, and by 1899 they were everywhere. There's even a story from Kansas City that year about the city forester believing more hitching posts would mean fewer injured trees. Let your breathing slow as we move inside the homestead. Dutch and Arthur search for supplies, and everything they find has its own history. The oatcakes in the pantry trace their origins to Scotland in the 1st century, during the Roman conquest of Britain. They travelled to Canada with Scottish immigrants in the late 18th century and eventually made their way south. The canned goods on the shelves represent a revolution in food preservation. In 1795, the French government offered a cash reward to anyone who could invent a cheap way to preserve food for their armies. a confectioner named Nicholas Appert discovered that food packed in airtight containers didn't decay. By 1810, the tin can had been invented, and by 1812, the first canning factory opened in New York City. Arthur finds a can of baked beans, and the timing here is tight but plausible. The first mass-produced canned baked beans appeared in 1895, made by the H.J. Heinz Company in Pennsylvania, just 4 years before the game is set. Heinz products were reaching Colorado by 1897, though beans specifically aren't mentioned in records until 1902. But in a remote homestead like the Adlers, supplies could have come from anywhere. The salted beef on the table connects to an even older tradition. Salting meat to preserve it may date back to ancient times, when people in cold regions discovered that salt prevented spoilage. The English gave us the term corned beef in the 17th century, named for the large grains of salt used in the curing process. Even the beer has a story. Schiffer beer in the game seems to be inspired by real breweries like the F and M. Schaefer Brewing Company, founded in New York in 1842, and the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company of Milwaukee, which became the largest beer producer in America by 1902. The name Schiffer itself is a German surname, and the similar word Schiffen is old slang for urinating, which fits perfectly with rock stars' tradition of crude humour in their fictional brands. As you settle deeper into your pillow, let's talk about the horses. Every breed in the game is based on a real breed, and each one carries centuries of history. The Arabian is considered one of the oldest human-developed breeds, its lineage stretching back thousands of years. The Suffolk Punch has the longest unbroken written pedigree of any horse. The Morgan can be traced to a single foundation sire named Figure, owned by a man named Justin Morgan. The Missouri Foxtrotter was developed from a combination of Arabian and Morgan horses, with later contributions from the American Saddlebred, Tennessee Walker, and Standardbred. Horses were domesticated thousands of years before the game's setting, and horse-drawn carriages have been used for just about as long. When you see the gang moving their wagons through the snow, you're watching a scene that could have played out almost identically in 1899. The wildlife in the game is equally authentic. When Arthur and Javier rescue John from wolves in those early missions, they're encountering grey wolves that were indeed common in the Rocky Mountains at that time. In fact, there were active efforts to exterminate them in Wyoming. Wolves made their way near Fort Collins, Colorado in 1899, and attacks on humans weren't unheard of. A wolf hunter named Peter Watson was attacked by a grey wolf in Nebraska that year, but managed to kill it with a small revolver. Watson killed an average of 400 wolves per year for the State Stock Association, though that number had dropped to around 200 by the turn of the century. The grey wolf population was in steep decline. In Colorado, the last wild wolf was shot in 1945, and it wasn't until 2021 that an initiative was approved to reintroduce them. The wolves Arthur encounters are ghosts of a population that would soon vanish from those mountains entirely. The deer that Arthur and Charles hunt are equally authentic. White-tailed deer are native to North America, especially near the Rocky Mountains, though mule deer would be more common in Colorado specifically. Records from 1899 show white-tailed deer being spotted and hunted in October and November after heavy storms pushed them down from the mountains, and that grizzly bear that nearly catches them. Grizzlies were still present in Colorado in 1899, though their numbers were falling fast. Between 1850 and 1920, they were eliminated from 95% of their original range. In the North Cascades area of Washington, more than 3,700 grizzly bear hides were shipped from trading posts between 1827 and 1859. In Colorado, the grizzly was considered locally extinct by 1951, until a man named Ed Wiseman killed one with an arrow in 1979 after being attacked and mauled. It was the last confirmed sighting of a wild grizzly in Colorado. Let your mind drift now to the people of the Vanderlind gang and the complex history they represent. Charles Smith speaks of having a black father and an Indian mother, and both of those terms carry weight. The word Indian to describe Native Americans dates back to Christopher Columbus, who believed he had reached the Indies when he arrived in the Americas in 1492. The name stuck, even though it arose from a geographical error. Some people object to the term because it doesn't reflect the origins or diversity of indigenous peoples. Others object to Native American for similar reasons, as it too was assigned by colonizers. Different indigenous groups have their own names for the land. Turtle Island for many Algonquian and Haudenosaunee peoples, Abya Yala for the Kuna people of Colombia and Panama. The best approach is usually to use whatever name a particular group prefers, typically the name of their own tribe or nation. Charles mentions that Dutch treats him fairly, and that most of the gang does too, but that this isn't normally the case. He's right. America in 1899 was deeply discriminatory against both Black Americans and Native Americans. But the game's portrayal of a more accepting gang isn't historically impossible. Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch was all white, but Cassidy himself was known to stand up for black workers he encountered. There were people and groups actively supporting civil rights even then, and many more who simply didn't hold strong prejudices either way. A small gang of criminals sharing similar outlooks isn't far-fetched, especially when some members are still clearly racist and sexist anyway. The camp cook, Pearson, loves to talk about his time in the Navy, and Arthur's reluctance to hear those stories might be more than just annoyance. There was a common stereotype that men in the Navy, isolated at sea for long periods, would engage in sexual relations with each other. There were documented cases of this, and the stereotype grew stronger in the 20th century, particularly after a 1919 scandal in Newport, Rhode Island, when the Navy investigated gay personnel by having other sailors seduce them into entrapment. A Senate committee later denounced the investigation's methods. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who would later become the longest-serving president in American history. When Pearson shares his Navy rum with Arthur, the strong reaction makes perfect sense. Navy rum was traditionally 57% alcohol by volume, far stronger than most spirits. The term Navy strength emphasizes just how powerful it was. American sailors originally received about half a pint of distilled spirits daily, reduced to a quarter pint in 1842, and eliminated entirely during the Civil War. As you breathe slowly and let the tension leave your shoulders, consider the weapons the gang carries. Every firearm in the game has a real-world counterpart, and each one tells a story of innovation and violence. The Cattleman revolver is based on the Colt single-action army, perhaps the most iconic revolver of the Old West. Introduced in 1873, it was the standard service revolver of the US Army until 1892. Cowboys, lawmen and outlaws all carried it. The gun was so popular that it earned nicknames like the Peacemaker and the Equalizer. When you see Arthur drawing his revolver in a dusty street, you're watching a scene that played out countless times in the real 1890s. The Lancaster repeater mirrors the Winchester Model 1866, one of the first successful repeating rifles. It could fire multiple shots without reloading, a revolutionary advantage over single-shot weapons. The Winchester became known as the gun that won the West, though that's more marketing than history. Still, repeating rifles changed everything about frontier combat. The rolling block rifle in the game is based on the Remington rolling block, a single-shot rifle that was incredibly accurate at long range. It was used by military forces around the world and was popular with hunters and sharpshooters. Buffalo hunters used it to devastating effect, contributing to the near extinction of the American bison. The pump-action shotguns Arthur can use reflect weapons that were just becoming available in the 1890s. The Winchester Model 1897 was one of the first successful pump-action shotguns, introduced just 2 years before the game is set. It would go on to see extensive military use in World War I, where its effectiveness in trench warfare earned it the nickname the trench gun. Even the ammunition is historically grounded. The game features different types of rounds: regular, high velocity, express, explosive, and more. While some of these are exaggerated for gameplay, the basic concept of different ammunition types for different purposes was well established by 1899. Hunters and soldiers alike understood that the right bullet for the job could mean the difference between success and failure. The dynamite that Bill sets up beneath the railway bridge has its own fascinating history. In France, a Swedish chemist named Alfred Nobel studied under a Russian chemist whose other student, an Italian, first synthesized nitroglycerin in 1847. Nobel and his family experimented with the volatile substance for years, and he performed the first successful controlled detonation in 1863. He originally sold his invention as Nobel's blasting powder, but changed the name to dynamite, based on the ancient Greek word dynamis, meaning power. The giant powder company was incorporated in San Francisco in 1867 to manufacture dynamite under license from Nobel, bringing the explosive to America. 30 years later, it found its way into the hands of outlaws like the O'Driscolls, and then into the possession of the Van der Linde gang. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, that a French newspaper published Nobel's obituary while he was still alive, criticizing him for inventing military explosives. The story goes that this inspired Nobel to leave a better legacy, and upon his death his wealth was used to establish the Nobel Prize. Whether or not the obituary actually existed, the prizes certainly do, and they continue to be awarded today. The method of detonation in the game is accurate too. Nobel realized in 1864 that nitroglycerin couldn't be set off by a simple fuse, but it could be triggered by the explosion of a small charge of gunpowder, which could be ignited by a fuse. This is essentially how Arthur and Bill set up their explosives beneath the bridge. The railroad itself represents one of the great transformations of the American West. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, connecting the East Coast to the West Coast for the first time. It changed everything. Journeys that once took months by wagon could now be completed in days. Goods could be shipped across the country. Towns sprang up along the rail lines, and those that were bypassed often withered and died. By 1899, the railroad network had expanded enormously. Multiple companies operated lines across the West, and train robbery had become a romantic, if dangerous, profession for outlaws. The Van der Linde gang's train heists mirror real crimes committed by gangs like Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, who robbed trains throughout the 1890s. The water tower near the tracks is a railroad water tank, used to refill the boilers of steam locomotives. These towers were essential infrastructure, placed at regular intervals along the lines. Steam engines consumed enormous amounts of water, and without these refilling stations, long-distance rail travel would have been impossible. Let your eyes rest now as we drift south, down from the frozen mountains into the heartland. The gang eventually makes their way to a place called the Heartlands, and then to a town called Valentine. This rough cattle town feels like it could have existed anywhere in the Great Plains, and in many ways, it did. Valentine is a livestock town, built around the cattle trade. The stockyards dominate the landscape, and cowboys drive herds through the muddy streets. This was the reality of dozens of towns across Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas in the late 19th century. Towns like Dodge City, Abilene, and Wichita grew wealthy on the cattle trade, serving as endpoints for the great cattle drives that brought Texas longhorns north to the railroads. The game's Valentine seems to draw inspiration from several of these towns. Its wooden buildings, its saloons, its general store all reflect the architecture of the period. Buildings were constructed quickly and cheaply, often from whatever materials were available. Fire was a constant threat, and many frontier towns burned down multiple times before being rebuilt in brick or stone. The mud in Valentine streets is historically accurate too, perhaps uncomfortably so. Frontier towns rarely had paved roads. When it rained, the streets became rivers of mud that could swallow a man's boots. When it was dry, the dust was choking. Either way, the streets were shared with horses, cattle, and all the waste that came with them. The romantic image of the Old West often leaves out the smell. The saloon in Valentine serves whiskey, beer, and other drinks, and drinking was indeed a central part of frontier social life. Saloons were more than just bars. They were meeting places, gambling halls, and sometimes brothels. A town might have more saloons than churches, and the line between respectable and disreputable was often blurry. The poker games in the back rooms reflect a genuine frontier pastime. Gambling was widespread and largely unregulated. Card games, dice games, and betting on everything from horse races to dog fights were common. Professional gamblers travelled from town to town, and cheating was so prevalent that getting caught could mean getting shot. The general store in Valentine sells everything from canned food to ammunition to clothing. These stores were the lifeline of frontier communities, stocking goods that couldn't be produced locally. A good general store might carry hundreds of different items, from farm equipment to patent medicines to the latest fashions from back east. The prices in the game roughly reflect the economics of the time, when $1 could buy what might cost $50 or $100 today. The clothing Arthur can buy and wear throughout the game reflects the fashions of the 1890s with remarkable accuracy. Men's clothing in this era was practical but not without style. The three-piece suit was standard for businessmen and professionals, while working men wore simpler garments suited to their labour. Cowboys wore wide-brimmed hats to protect against sun and rain, and the styles varied by region. The Stetson, introduced in 1865, became the iconic cowboy hat, though many other manufacturers produced similar designs. The hats in the game reflect this variety, from simple work hats to more elaborate styles. Bandanas served multiple purposes: protection from dust, disguise during robberies, and simple fashion. The classic image of an outlaw with a bandana pulled up over his face has its roots in reality, though it probably wasn't as effective a disguise as the movies suggest. Boots were essential, designed for riding with heels that could catch in stirrups and pointed toes that could slip easily into them. The craftsmanship varied enormously. from simple work boots to elaborately tooled leather that could cost a month's wages. Gun belts and holsters evolved throughout the 19th century. The quick-draw holster of Western movies is largely a Hollywood invention. Most real gunfighters carried their weapons in more practical arrangements. But by 1899, the basic design of a belt with an attached holster was well established. The women's clothing in the game is equally authentic. Long dresses were standard, with styles varying by class and occasion. Working women wore simpler, more practical garments, while wealthy women followed the elaborate fashions of the East Coast and Europe. Corsets were still common, though the extreme tight lacing of earlier decades was falling out of favour. The game even gets the undergarments right. When Arthur changes clothes, you can see the Union suit, a one-piece undergarment that was standard for men in this era. It provided warmth and a layer between the body and outer clothing, which might not be washed for weeks or months at a time. As your breathing deepens and your thoughts begin to soften, let's wander through the wilderness that surrounds these frontier towns. The landscape of Red Dead Redemption 2 is a compressed version of the American West, combining elements from multiple states into a single explorable world. The Great Plains region in the game evokes the grasslands of Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. These were the lands of the great buffalo herds, though by 1899 those herds were nearly gone. The American bison, which once numbered in the tens of millions, had been hunted almost to extinction. By the 1880s, fewer than 1,000 remained. The bones of the slaughtered animals littered the plains, and bone collectors made a living gathering them to be ground into fertilizer. The game shows this devastation. You can find buffalo in the game, but they're rare, confined to small areas. This reflects the reality of 1899, when the species was on the brink of disappearing forever. Conservation efforts would eventually save the bison, but the great herds of the past would never return. The forests of the game draw from multiple regions. The tall pines of the northern areas evoke the forests of Montana and Wyoming. The swamps of Lemoyne mirror the bayous of Louisiana. The desert regions reflect New Mexico and Arizona. It's a patchwork landscape, geographically impossible, but emotionally true to the diversity of the American West. The rivers and lakes are teeming with fish, and fishing was indeed an important food source and pastime in 1899. The species in the game are largely accurate to the regions they're found in: trout in the mountain streams, bass in the lakes, catfish in the southern waters. Fishing techniques hadn't changed much in centuries, and the simple rod and reel Arthur uses would have been familiar to any angler of the time. The weather systems in the game reflect the unpredictable nature of the American climate. Sudden thunderstorms roll across the plains, fog settles in the valleys, snow blankets the mountains. The West was known for its extreme weather, from droughts that lasted years to floods that washed away entire towns. Settlers learned to respect the land and its moods, or they didn't survive long. The Native American presence in the game touches on one of the most painful chapters of American history. The Wapiti Indian Reservation in the game reflects the reality of the reservation system that confined indigenous peoples to ever-shrinking parcels of land. By 1899, the Indian Wars were largely over. The massacre at Wounded Knee had occurred just 9 years earlier, in 1890, killing hundreds of Lakota men, women and children. The great chiefs who had resisted American expansion were dead or confined to reservations. Sitting Bull had been killed in 1890. Geronimo had surrendered in 1886 and was living as a prisoner of war. The reservation system was designed to control and assimilate Native Americans. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their traditions. The goal, as one official put it, was to kill the Indian and save the man. It was cultural genocide, and its effects are still felt today. The game portrays the Wapiti Reservation as a place of poverty and despair, which is historically accurate. Reservations were often located on the least desirable land, far from traditional hunting grounds and sacred sites. The promised supplies and payments from the government frequently failed to arrive, or were stolen by corrupt agents. Disease, malnutrition, and alcoholism devastated communities. Rains Fall, the chief of the Wapiti in the game, represents a generation of native leaders who had to navigate an impossible situation. Fight and be destroyed, or submit and watch your culture slowly die. Many chose a middle path, preserving what they could while adapting to the new reality. Their descendants continue that work today, reviving languages and traditions that were nearly lost. The game treats this history with more respect than many Western stories. It doesn't romanticize or simplify. It shows the complexity and the tragedy, the dignity of people facing impossible choices. As you drift towards sleep, consider the weight of that history, the lives that were lived and lost on this land long before any of us were born. Let your mind drift now to the city of St. Denis, the game's version of New Orleans. This is where the Old West meets the New South, where the frontier gives way to something older and more complex. New Orleans in 1899 was one of the most unique cities in America. Founded by the French in 1718, it had been Spanish, French again, and finally American after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. But it never quite felt like the rest of the country. The architecture was different, a blend of French, Spanish, and Caribbean influences. The culture was different, shaped by Creole traditions and African heritage. Even the legal system was different, based on French civil law rather than English common law. The game captures this distinctiveness beautifully. The wrought iron balconies, the narrow streets, the mix of grand mansions and humble shotgun houses, the sounds of jazz drifting from doorways, though jazz as we know it was still in its infancy in 1899. The music in the game's saloons and streets reflects the ragtime and early jazz that was emerging from New Orleans at the turn of the century. The city's diversity is reflected in its population. St. Denis, like New Orleans, is home to people of French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, and American descent. The Creole culture, a blend of all these influences, gives the city its unique character. The food, the music, the language, all reflect this mixing of traditions. The trolley system in Saint Denis mirrors the streetcars that were transforming American cities in the 1890s. New Orleans had one of the oldest streetcar systems in the world, dating back to 1835. By 1899, electric streetcars were replacing the older horse-drawn and steam-powered versions. The St. Charles line in New Orleans, which still operates today, is the oldest continuously operating streetcar line in the world. The wealth on display in St. Denis reflects the prosperity of the Gilded Age. The mansions of the wealthy, the fine restaurants, the theatres and opera houses. But alongside this wealth was grinding poverty. The gap between rich and poor was enormous, and the working class lived in conditions that would shock modern sensibilities. 12-hour workdays, child labour, dangerous factories, all were common. The labour movement was growing. but it would be decades before workers won basic protections. The criminal underworld of St. Denis reflects the reality of urban crime in the Gilded Age. Organised crime was flourishing in American cities, with gangs controlling everything from gambling to prostitution to labour unions. The Italian mafia was establishing itself in New Orleans, and the city had a reputation for corruption and violence. The Bronte crime family in the game mirrors these real criminal organisations. Angelo Bronte's control over the city's underworld, his connections to politicians and police, his veneer of respectability, all reflect the way organised crime operated in this era. The line between legitimate business and criminal enterprise was often blurry, and many of the great fortunes of the Gilded Age were built on exploitation and corruption. The game's portrayal of race relations in St. Denis is also historically grounded. The Jim Crow era was in full swing by 1899. Segregation was the law throughout the South, and black Americans faced discrimination, violence, and disenfranchisement. The gains of Reconstruction had been rolled back, and it would be decades before the civil rights movement began to challenge the system. New Orleans had a more complex racial history than much of the South. The city's Creole population included people of mixed African and European descent who had occupied a middle position in the social hierarchy. But by 1899, the rigid binary of Jim Crow was being imposed even here. The famous Plessy versus Ferguson case, which established the separate but equal doctrine, originated in New Orleans in 1892. The game doesn't shy away from this history. You encounter racism throughout St. Denis, from casual slurs to systemic discrimination. It's uncomfortable, as it should be. The past wasn't a simpler time. It was often crueler, and the game respects its players enough to show that cruelty honestly. The newspapers in St. Denis report on events that mirror real headlines of 1899. Political scandals, labour disputes, technological innovations, international affairs. The Spanish-American War had just ended, and America was emerging as a world power. The Philippines were in revolt against American occupation. The Boer War was beginning in South Africa. The world was changing rapidly, and the newspapers of the time struggled to keep up. As your body grows heavier and your thoughts begin to blur at the edges, let's consider the technology of 1899. The world was on the cusp of the modern age, and the game captures this transitional moment beautifully. Electricity was transforming cities. Thomas Edison had opened the first commercial power station in New York in 1882, and by 1899, electric lights were becoming common in urban areas. St. Denis glows with electric lights, while the rural areas still rely on kerosene lamps and candles. This contrast between the electrified city and the dark countryside was a defining feature of the era. The telephone was spreading rapidly. Alexander Graham Bell had patented it in 1876, and by 1899 there were nearly 1 million telephones in the United States. The game includes telephones in some locations, reflecting their growing presence. But they were still rare in rural areas, and most communication still relied on letters and telegrams. The telegraph had been around for decades and had transformed communication. Messages that once took weeks to deliver could now be sent in minutes. The telegraph office in Valentine represents this technology, connecting the frontier to the wider world. News of crimes, wanted posters, and business transactions all travelled by wire. Photography was well established by 1899, and the game includes a photographer who can take Arthur's portrait. The technology had advanced significantly since its invention in the 1830s. Cameras were smaller and more portable. exposure times were shorter, and photographs were becoming a common part of everyday life. The Kodak camera, introduced in 1888, had made photography accessible to amateurs for the first time. The automobile was just beginning to appear. The first successful American gasoline car was built in 1893, and by 1899 there were a few thousand cars in the country. The game includes a few automobiles reflecting their novelty. They were expensive, unreliable, and viewed with suspicion by many. Horses would remain the primary mode of transportation for another 2 decades. The bicycle had become enormously popular in the 1890s. The safety bicycle, with its equal-sized wheels and chain drive, had replaced the dangerous high-wheelers of the earlier decades. Bicycles gave people, especially women, a new freedom of movement. The bicycle craze contributed to the Good Roads movement, which would eventually lead to the highway system. Motion pictures were brand new. The Lumiere brothers had held their first public screening in 1895, and by 1899 short films were being shown in vaudeville theatres and Nickelodeons. The game includes a theatre in St. Denis that shows early films, reflecting this emerging technology. No one yet imagined that movies would become one of the dominant art forms of the 20th century. Medicine in 1899 was a mixture of genuine science and dangerous quackery, and the game reflects this accurately. The germ theory of disease had been established, and doctors understood the importance of sanitation and sterilization. But many treatments were still ineffective or harmful. Patent medicines were everywhere, promising to cure everything from baldness to tuberculosis. These tonics and elixirs often contained alcohol, opium, or cocaine, and their manufacturers made wild claims with no scientific basis. The game includes several patent medicines, and their descriptions mirror the exaggerated advertising of the time. Tuberculosis, the disease that afflicts Arthur in the later chapters of the game, was one of the great killers of the 19th century. It was called consumption because it seemed to consume its victims from within, causing them to waste away over months or years. There was no cure. Patients were sent to sanatoriums in the hope that fresh air and rest might help, but most died. The disease was highly contagious, spread through coughing and close contact. It thrived in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, making it especially deadly in cities and among the poor. By 1899, scientists understood how it spread, but effective treatment wouldn't come until the development of antibiotics in the mid-20th century. Arthur's diagnosis is a death sentence, and the game doesn't soften this reality. The slow decline, the coughing fits, the gradual loss of strength, all are portrayed with unflinching accuracy. It's a reminder that life in 1899 was fragile in ways we've largely forgotten. Diseases that are easily treated today were killers then. Dentistry was primitive by modern standards. Tooth extraction was common, often performed without anesthesia. Dentures were made from various materials, including human teeth taken from corpses. The game includes a dentist in St. Denis, and while it doesn't show the full horror of 19th century dental care, the implication is there. Surgery had advanced significantly thanks to anesthesia and antiseptic techniques, but it was still dangerous. Many operations that are routine today were life-threatening then. Hospitals were places people went to die, not to be healed. Those who could afford it were treated at home. The law enforcement in the game reflects the complex and often corrupt reality of policing in 1899. There was no unified system of law enforcement. Instead, There was a patchwork of local sheriffs, town marshals, federal marshals, and private detectives, each with their own jurisdictions and methods. Sheriffs were elected officials responsible for law enforcement in their counties. Their effectiveness varied enormously depending on the individual and the community. Some were dedicated lawmen who risked their lives to maintain order. Others were corrupt, incompetent, or simply overwhelmed by the challenges they faced. Town marshals handled law enforcement within city limits. In frontier towns, this could be an extremely dangerous job. The famous lawmen of the Old West, men like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, served as marshals in various towns. Their reputations were often exaggerated, but the dangers they faced were real. Federal marshals had jurisdiction across state lines and were responsible for enforcing federal law. They pursued fugitives, served warrants, and maintained order in federal territories. The U.S. Marshals Service was one of the oldest federal law enforcement agencies, dating back to 1789. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, which inspired the game's Pinkerton Agents, was a private organisation that often worked alongside or in place of official law enforcement. Founded in 1850, the Pinkertons gained fame for foiling an assassination plot against Abraham Lincoln and for pursuing outlaws like Jesse James. But they also had a darker reputation, serving as strikebreakers and spies for corporations battling labour unions. The bounty system in the game reflects a real practice. Wanted posters offered rewards for the capture of criminals, dead or alive. Bounty hunters pursued these rewards, operating in a legal grey area. They had no official authority, but they were tolerated because they helped bring criminals to justice. The ethics of the profession were questionable, and bounty hunters were often little better than the outlaws they pursued. The prison system was harsh. Conditions were brutal, with overcrowding, disease, and violence common. Chain gangs worked prisoners in fields and on roads, a practice that continued well into the 20th century. The concept of rehabilitation was largely absent. Prisons were meant to punish, not reform. Let your thoughts drift now to the outlaws themselves, the men and women who lived outside the law in the dying days of the frontier. The Van der Linde gang is fictional, but they're built from the pieces of real criminal organisations. Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch are perhaps the closest real-world parallel. Robert Leroy Parker, known as Butch Cassidy, led a loose confederation of outlaws who robbed banks and trains throughout the 1890s. Like Dutch van der Linde, Cassidy was known for his charisma and his ability to inspire loyalty. Unlike many outlaws, he tried to avoid violence when possible. The Wild Bunch included colourful characters like the Sundance Kid, whose real name was Harry Alonzo Longabore. They operated across multiple states, using the remote hole-in-the-wall country of Wyoming as a hideout. The gang's exploits became legendary, though the reality was often more mundane than the myths suggest. By 1899, the Wild Bunch was feeling the pressure of modernization. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was pursuing them relentlessly. Railroads and banks were improving their security. The telegraph meant that news of robberies spread quickly, making escape more difficult. In 1901, Cassidy and Sundance fled to South America, where they continued their criminal careers until their deaths, probably in Bolivia in 1908. The Dalton Gang offers another parallel. The Dalton brothers started as lawmen before turning to crime, robbing trains and banks across Kansas and Oklahoma. Their career ended spectacularly in 1892, when they attempted to rob 2 banks simultaneously in Coffeyville, Kansas. The townspeople fought back, and 4 of the gang members were killed, along with 4 citizens. Jesse James and his gang had operated a generation earlier, but their legend loomed large over the outlaws of 1899. James was killed in 1882, shot in the back by a member of his own gang seeking the reward money. His death became a symbol of the treachery that plagued outlaw life, a theme the game explores through characters like Micah Bell. The reality of outlaw life was less romantic than the legends suggest. Most outlaws lived in poverty, constantly on the run, unable to trust anyone. Many died young, killed by lawmen, rivals, or their own associates. Those who survived often spent years in prison. The freedom they sought was illusory, purchased at the cost of everything else. The women of the Van der Linde gang reflect the limited options available to women in 1899. Abigail, Sadie, Mary Beth, Karen, Tilly, and the others each represent different paths through a world that offered women few choices. Women in 1899 couldn't vote in most states. Wyoming had granted women's suffrage in 1869, and a few other western states followed, but it would be another 20 years before the 19th Amendment extended the right nationwide. Women were expected to marry, bear children, and manage households. Those who didn't fit this mould faced limited options. Working-class women laboured in factories, as domestic servants, or in other low-paying jobs. The conditions were often brutal, with long hours, low wages, and no protections. Sexual harassment and exploitation were common and rarely punished. Women who fell outside respectable society, whether by choice or circumstance, often turned to prostitution, one of the few professions where women could earn a living wage. The game includes prostitutes in its saloons and towns, reflecting the reality of frontier life. Prostitution was widespread and often tolerated, though the women who practiced it faced social stigma and legal harassment. Some worked in elaborate brothels, others walked the streets. Their lives were difficult and often short, marked by violence, disease, and addiction. Sadie Adler's transformation from grieving widow to deadly gunfighter is unusual but not impossible. There were women who lived outside traditional roles, who rode and shot and fought alongside men. Calamity Jane, Pearl Hart, and Belle Starr were real women who gained notoriety in the Old West. They were exceptions, but they existed. The suffrage movement was gaining strength in 1899. Women were organising, marching, and demanding the right to participate in democracy. The fight would continue for another 2 decades, but the seeds of change were being planted. The world the Van der Linde gang knew was changing, and women were part of that change. As sleep draws closer and your thoughts grow softer, consider the economy of 1899. The Gilded Age was drawing to a close, but its inequalities remained stark. A small number of industrialists controlled vast fortunes, while millions of workers struggled to survive. The robber barons, men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan, had built empires in oil, steel, and finance. Their wealth was almost incomprehensible, measured in hundreds of millions of dollars at a time when the average worker earned less than $500 a year. They built mansions, collected art, and wielded political power that rivaled the government itself. The game's wealthy characters, like Leviticus Cornwall, reflect these real industrialists. Cornwall's control over railroads and oil mirrors the monopolies that dominated the American economy. His willingness to use violence and corruption to protect his interest was standard practice among the robber barons, who employed private armies and bought politicians without shame. For ordinary people, life was a constant struggle. Farmers faced falling prices and rising debts. squeezed by railroads that charged whatever they pleased, and banks that foreclosed without mercy. Factory workers laboured in dangerous conditions for wages that barely covered food and rent. Children worked alongside adults, their small hands useful for tasks that adults couldn't perform. The labour movement was growing in response to these conditions. Unions organised workers and demanded better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Strikes were common and often violent, as companies hired private security forces to break them. The Homestead Strike of 1892 and the Pullman Strike of 1894 had shown both the power and the limits of organised labour. The Panic of 1893 had plunged the country into depression, and recovery was slow. Unemployment remained high, and many families lived on the edge of destitution. The prosperity that would mark the early 20th century was still years away. For the people of 1899, the future was uncertain and often frightening. Money in the game reflects the economics of the time. $1 in 1899 had the purchasing power of roughly $30 today. A meal might cost a quarter, a night in a hotel $1 or $2. The prices Arthur pays for guns, horses and supplies are roughly accurate to what they would have cost in the real 1899. The religious life of 1899 America was diverse and deeply felt. Churches were central to community life, providing not just spiritual guidance but social services, education, and a sense of belonging. The game includes churches in its towns, and the travelling preacher Arthur encounters reflects the evangelical tradition that was strong in the rural West. Protestant Christianity dominated, with Methodists, Baptists and Presbyterians among the largest denominations. But there was enormous variety, from the formal liturgies of Episcopalians to the emotional revivals of Pentecostals. Camp meetings and tent revivals drew thousands, offering salvation and spectacle in equal measure. Catholicism was growing, fueled by immigration from Ireland, Italy and Eastern Europe. Catholic churches served immigrant communities, providing a connection to the old country and supporting the new. Anti-Catholic prejudice was common, and the tension between Protestant and Catholic Americans would continue for decades. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, had established themselves in Utah after their long migration west. Their practice of polygamy had brought them into conflict with the federal government, and they had officially abandoned it in 1890. But suspicion of Mormons remained widespread, and they were often treated as outsiders. Native American spirituality persisted despite decades of suppression. The ghost dance movement of the 1890s had promised a return to the old ways, a restoration of the buffalo and the ancestors. The movement ended in tragedy at Wounded Knee, but indigenous spiritual practices continued in secret, preserved by elders who refused to let them die. The game touches on religion through various characters and encounters. Some express sincere faith, others are hypocrites or charlatans. This reflects the reality of religious life in any era, where genuine devotion exists alongside exploitation and self-deception. The frontier attracted both saints and sinners, and often they were the same people. Spiritualism was popular in the late 19th century, with seances and mediums claiming to communicate with the dead. The movement had begun in 1848 and reached its peak in the decades following the Civil War, when so many families had lost loved ones. The game includes a fortune teller who may or may not have genuine powers, reflecting the ambiguity that surrounded such practices. The entertainment of 1899 was simpler than what we know today, but no less important to the people who enjoyed it. Without television, radio, or internet, people found amusement in ways that seem quaint now, but were vibrant and exciting then. Vaudeville was at its peak, offering variety shows that combined comedy, music, acrobatics, and drama. Theatres in cities like St. Denis would have hosted touring vaudeville companies, bringing entertainment to audiences hungry for distraction. The shows were often crude by modern standards, relying on ethnic stereotypes and slapstick humour, but they were enormously popular. The circus was a major event when it came to town. Barnum and Bailey, Ringling Brothers, and dozens of smaller operations travelled the country, setting up their big tops and parading their exotic animals through the streets. The circus offered a glimpse of the wider world, with performers and animals from distant lands. It was spectacle on a scale that nothing else could match. Wild West shows had been popular since Buffalo Bill Cody launched his in 1883. These shows romanticised the frontier, featuring mock battles between cowboys and Indians, sharpshooting demonstrations and reenactments of famous events. They helped create the mythology of the Old West that persists to this day, even as the real West was disappearing. Baseball was becoming America's pastime. Professional leagues had been established, and teams travelled by rail to play in cities across the country. The game was rougher than modern baseball, with fewer rules and more violence, but it captured the public imagination in a way that no other sport could match. Horse racing drew crowds and gambling money. Tracks operated in cities and towns, and betting was widespread despite efforts to suppress it. The Kentucky Derby had been running since 1875, and it was already one of the premier events in American sports. Reading was a primary form of entertainment for those who were literate. Newspapers were cheap and widely available, offering news, opinion, and serialized fiction. Dime novels told sensational stories of adventure and romance, often set in the West. Libraries were expanding, bringing books to communities that had never had access to them before. Music filled homes and public spaces. Pianos were status symbols, and families gathered around them to sing popular songs. Brass bands played in parks and at public events. The phonograph, invented by Edison in 1877, was beginning to bring recorded music into homes, though it was still a novelty in 1899. The food of 1899 was shaped by what was available locally and what could be preserved for long periods. Refrigeration was limited, and most families relied on traditional methods of preservation: salting, smoking, drying, and canning. Meat was a staple, but it had to be fresh or preserved. Beef, pork, and chicken were common, along with game like deer, rabbit, and wild birds. In coastal areas, fish and shellfish were important. The quality varied enormously depending on where you lived and what you could afford. Bread was baked at home or purchased from local bakeries. White bread was a luxury. Most people ate darker breads made from whole grains. Biscuits and cornbread were staples in the South and West, quick to make and filling. Vegetables came from gardens or local farms. Potatoes, beans, corn, and squash were common. Fresh vegetables were seasonal. In winter, families relied on what they'd preserved or stored in root cellars. Canned vegetables were becoming more available, but they were expensive and often of poor quality. Fruit was a treat, especially in winter. Apples stored well and were available year-round in many areas. Citrus fruits were exotic luxuries in most of the country, available only to the wealthy or those who lived in the south. Dried fruits and preserves extended the fruit season, but fresh fruit in winter was rare. Coffee and tea were the beverages of choice for adults. Coffee was especially popular in the West, where it was brewed strong and black. Tea was more common in the East and among the upper classes. Both were imported and relatively expensive, but they were considered necessities rather than luxuries. Alcohol was widely consumed despite the growing temperance movement. Beer, whiskey and wine were available in saloons and stores. Home brewing and distilling were common, especially in rural areas. The temperance movement was gaining strength, and prohibition would come in 1920. But in 1899, drinking was still a normal part of daily life for many Americans. The game's food items reflect this reality. The canned goods, the coffee, the whiskey, the game meat that Arthur hunts and cooks, all are authentic to the period. The campfire meals the gang shares would have been familiar to anyone living on the frontier in 1899. As your eyelids grow heavier and the world outside fades away, let's wander through the smaller details that make the game's world feel so alive. These are the touches that most players might not notice, but they add up to create something that feels genuinely historical. The newspapers Arthur can buy are filled with stories that mirror real events of 1899. Political scandals, technological innovations, international affairs, all are drawn from the headlines of the time. The writing style mimics the journalism of the era, more florid and opinionated than modern news writing. The wanted posters that appear when Arthur commits crimes reflect the real system of bounties and rewards. The descriptions, the reward amounts, the warnings about the suspect being armed and dangerous, all are authentic to the period. The letters Arthur receives and can send reflect the importance of mail in an era before telephones were common. People maintained relationships across vast distances through correspondence, and letters could take weeks to arrive. The postal service was a lifeline connecting isolated communities to the wider world. The books Arthur can read include titles that were popular in 1899. Dime novels, adventure stories and practical guides all appear on shelves and in saddlebags. Reading was one of the few entertainments available to people in remote areas, and books were treasured possessions. The cigarette cards Arthur collects were a real phenomenon. Tobacco companies included collectible cards in their packages, featuring everything from famous actors to exotic animals. Collecting these cards was a popular hobby, and complete sets were valuable. The practice continued well into the 20th century. The photographs Arthur can have taken reflect the growing accessibility of photography. Portrait studios existed in most towns, offering people a chance to preserve their images for posterity. The formal poses, the painted backdrops, the serious expressions, all are authentic to the period. The gravestones in the game's cemeteries tell stories of lives cut short by disease, violence, and accident. The inscriptions reflect the religious sentiments of the time, with references to heaven, rest, and reunion with loved ones. Infant mortality was high, and many gravestones mark the deaths of children. The graffiti and signs scattered throughout the world reflect the concerns and humour of the era. Political slogans, advertisements, warnings, and crude jokes all appear on walls and fences. They're easy to miss, but they add texture to the world. The architecture of the game's buildings reflects the construction methods and styles of the late 19th century. Different regions have different architectural traditions, and the game captures these distinctions. In the frontier towns like Valentine, buildings are simple wooden structures, quickly built and easily replaced. False fronts make buildings appear larger and more impressive than they are, a common practice in Western towns trying to project an image of prosperity and permanence. In St. Denis, the architecture is more elaborate, reflecting the city's wealth and history. The French and Spanish influences are visible in the wrought iron balconies, the courtyards, and the narrow streets. Brick and stone replace wood, and buildings are designed to last for generations. The mansions of the wealthy display the eclectic tastes of the Gilded Age. Victorian architecture mixed elements from many periods and places, creating elaborate confections of towers, gables, and ornamental details. These houses were designed to impress, to display the wealth and taste of their owners. The humble dwellings of the poor are equally authentic. Shotgun houses, so named because a bullet fired through the front door could pass through every room and exit the back, were common in the South. Sod houses and dugouts sheltered settlers on the treeless plains. Log cabins, the iconic frontier dwelling, still housed families in remote areas. Churches followed established patterns, with steeples pointing toward heaven and interiors designed to focus attention on the pulpit or altar. The simple wooden churches of frontier towns contrast with the more elaborate stone churches of established cities. Railroad stations were important civic buildings, often designed to impress us, travellers with the prosperity and ambition of the community. They served as gateways, the first impression visitors received of a town. The stations in the game reflect this importance, with their distinctive architecture and prominent locations. Barns and outbuildings follow practical designs developed over centuries. The gambrel roof, the hay loft, the stalls for animals, all are authentic to the period. These buildings were essential to agricultural life, and their designs were refined by generations of farmers. The sounds of the game's world are as carefully researched as the visuals. The clop of horse hooves on different surfaces, the creak of wagon wheels, the whistle of trains, all are authentic to the period. The music reflects the diverse musical traditions of 1899 America. In saloons, ragtime piano fills the air, a style that was just reaching its peak popularity. In St. Denis, early jazz can be heard, this sound that would come to define American music in the 20th century. In camp, the gang sings folk songs and ballads that had been passed down for generations. The accents and dialects of the characters reflect the regional and ethnic diversity of the time. Southern drawls, Irish brogues, and the clipped speech of the Northeast all appear. The game's voice actors researched historical speech patterns to create authentic-sounding dialogue. The ambient sounds of nature are equally authentic. The calls of birds, the howls of wolves, the buzz of insects, all are drawn from the real fauna of the regions the game depicts. The silence of the wilderness, broken only by natural sounds, would have been familiar to anyone living on the frontier. The sounds of industry intrude in certain areas. The clang of hammers in blacksmith shops, the roar of furnaces, the hiss of steam engines, all represent the industrial revolution that was transforming America. These sounds were new to many people in 1899, harbingers of a world that was rapidly changing. The human sounds of daily life fill the towns and cities. Conversations, arguments, laughter, and crying all contribute to the sense of a living world. Street vendors call out their wares, children play and shout, dogs bark and horses whinny. It's a symphony of ordinary life, carefully composed to feel natural and unscripted. The gunshots in the game are based on recordings of period-appropriate weapons. The crack of a rifle, the boom of a shotgun, the sharp report of a revolver, all are distinct and authentic. The sounds of violence are not glamorized. They're presented as what they are, loud and frightening and final. Let your mind drift now to the strangers Arthur meets on his journey, the random encounters that populate the world. Many of these are based on real types of people who would have been found in 1899 America. The snake oil salesmen who hawk their dubious remedies from the backs of wagons were a genuine plague on frontier communities. They promised cures for everything and delivered nothing, moving on before their customers realised they'd been cheated. Patent medicine was a massive industry, largely unregulated, and the harm it caused was enormous. The travelling preachers who set up camp and call sinners to repentance were common in rural America. Some were sincere men of faith, others were charlatans exploiting the religious feelings of isolated communities. The line between the two was often hard to discern. The suffragettes demanding the right to vote were part of a real movement that was gaining strength in 1899. Women had been organising and agitating for decades, and their persistence would eventually succeed. The hostility they faced from some men in the game reflects the real opposition they encountered. The veterans of the Civil War, now aging men haunted by memories of that terrible conflict, were everywhere in 1899. The war had ended 34 years earlier, but its wounds were still fresh. Veterans gathered at reunions, marched in parades, and struggled with what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The immigrants arriving from Europe brought their languages, customs, and hopes to a new land. They faced discrimination and exploitation, but they also built communities and contributed to the nation's growth. The game includes characters from various immigrant backgrounds, reflecting the diversity of 1899 America. The formerly enslaved people and their descendants were building lives in a country that had promised them freedom but delivered continued oppression. The game includes black characters in various roles, from labourers to professionals, reflecting the reality of black life in the post-Reconstruction South. The Chinese workers who had built the railroads faced severe discrimination, including the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned further immigration. Those already in the country lived in tight-knit communities, often in urban Chinatowns, maintaining their culture while adapting to American life. The animals of the game deserve special attention, for they represent one of the most impressive achievements of historical accuracy. The developers researched not just what animals existed in 1899, but where they lived, how they behaved, and how their populations had changed over time. The American bison, as we've discussed, was nearly extinct by 1899. The game shows them as rare, confined to small areas, a shadow of the great herds that once darkened the plains. This is historically accurate, and it serves as a reminder of the environmental destruction that accompanied westward expansion. The passenger pigeon, which appears in the game, was still alive in 1899 but would be extinct by 1914. Once the most numerous bird in North America, with flocks that darkened the sky for hours as they passed, the passenger pigeon was hunted to extinction in just a few decades. The last known individual, a female named Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo. The Carolina parakeet, the only parrot native to the eastern United States, was also nearing extinction in 1899. Habitat destruction and hunting had decimated their numbers, and the last confirmed sighting in the wild was in 1910. The species was declared extinct in 1939. The wolves, bears, and mountain lions in the game were all present in 1899, though their ranges were shrinking as human settlement expanded. Predator control programs driven by ranchers protecting their livestock would eventually eliminate these animals from much of their historic range. The elk and deer populations were at historic lows in 1899, depleted by decades of unregulated hunting. Conservation efforts, including the establishment of game laws and wildlife refuges, would eventually restore their numbers, but in 1899, seeing a deer was less common than it is today. The fish in the games, rivers and lakes reflect the species that would have been present in 1899. Trout, bass, catfish, and other species are found in appropriate habitats. Fishing was an important food source and recreational activity, and the techniques Arthur uses would have been familiar to any angler of the time. The domestic animals, horses, cattle, sheep and pigs, are all breeds that existed in 1899. The game includes multiple horse breeds, each with its own characteristics and history. The cattle reflect the longhorns and other breeds that were raised on western ranches. The chickens, pigs and other farm animals are authentic to the period. As sleep draws ever closer and your breathing slows to a gentle rhythm, consider the philosophical themes that run through the game. These too are grounded in the intellectual currents of 1899. The tension between civilization and wilderness was a central concern of the era. Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, published in 1893, argued that the American character had been shaped by the frontier experience, and that the closing of the frontier would fundamentally change the nation. The game explores this tension through Dutch's speeches about freedom and civilization, and through the gang's constant flight from the encroaching modern world. Social Darwinism, the application of evolutionary theory to human society, was influential in 1899. Its proponents argued that competition and survival of the fittest were natural laws that should govern society. This philosophy was used to justify inequality, imperialism, and the exploitation of workers. The game's wealthy villains embody this worldview, seeing themselves as superior beings entitled to dominate others. The progressive movement was emerging as a response to the excesses of the Gilded Age. Reformers sought to address poverty, corruption and inequality through government action. They advocated for labour laws, food safety regulations and political reforms. The tension between laissez-faire capitalism and progressive reform would define American politics for decades. Existential questions about meaning and mortality run through the game, especially in its later chapters. Arthur's confrontation with his own death forces him to consider what his life has meant and what legacy he will leave. These are timeless questions, but they took on particular urgency in an era when death was ever present and often sudden. The nature of loyalty and betrayal is explored through the gang's disintegration. Dutch's descent into paranoia and violence, Micah's treachery, Arthur's growing disillusionment, all reflect the fragility of human bonds under pressure. The game suggests that loyalty must be earned and maintained, that it cannot survive when trust is broken. The possibility of redemption is the game's central theme. Can a man who has done terrible things find forgiveness? Can he change? The game doesn't offer easy answers, but it suggests that the attempt matters, that trying to be better is itself a form of redemption, even if complete absolution is impossible. The epilogue of the game jumps forward to 1907, and the changes visible in that 8-year span reflect real historical developments. The world was transforming rapidly, and the differences between 1899 and 1907 were significant. Automobiles were becoming more common, though still rare. The Ford Model T would be introduced in 1908, making cars affordable for middle-class Americans for the first time. The game shows a few more cars in the epilogue, hinting at the transportation revolution to come, The telephone network had expanded significantly. More homes and businesses had phones, and long-distance calling was becoming practical. The isolation of rural areas was beginning to break down as communication technology improved. The airplane had been invented. The Wright brothers made their famous flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903, and by 1907 they were demonstrating their aircraft to military officials. The age of flight was beginning, though few could imagine how it would transform the world. The political landscape had shifted. Theodore Roosevelt had become president after McKinley's assassination in 1901, and he'd pursued an aggressive progressive agenda. Trust-busting, conservation and labour reform were changing the relationship between government and business. The frontier was definitively closed. Oklahoma, the last major territory, would become a state in 1907. The Wild West of legend was now firmly in the past, preserved only in memory and in the Wild West shows that continued to tour the country. John Marston's attempt to build a normal life in the epilogue reflects the choices facing many former outlaws and frontiersmen. The skills that had served them in the old world were becoming obsolete. They had to adapt or be left behind. Some succeeded, many didn't. The game ends with John's ranch established and his family reunited, but players who know the first Red Dead Redemption understand that this peace won't last. The past has a way of catching up, and the debts incurred in 1899 will come due in 1911. The cycle of violence continues, even as the world moves on. Let your thoughts grow softer now, like clouds dissolving at the edges. We've travelled far tonight, through mountains and plains, through cities and wilderness, through the dying days of an era that shaped the nation we know today. The Old West of 1899 was not the mythical place of movies and dime novels. It was a real place, inhabited by real people, facing real challenges. It was violent and beautiful, cruel and generous, dying and being born all at once. The game captures this complexity in ways that few works of art have managed. The attention to historical detail is remarkable, but it serves a larger purpose. By grounding its story in reality, the game makes its themes more powerful. The questions it asks about loyalty, redemption, and the meaning of a life are not abstract philosophical puzzles. They're questions that real people faced in 1899, and that we still face today. The world of Red Dead Redemption 2 is a world in transition. The old ways are dying, and the new ways are not yet fully formed. The characters are caught between these worlds, trying to find their place in a reality that no longer has room for them. It's a universal human experience, this sense of being out of time, of belonging to a world that no longer exists. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you the image of that world. The endless sky over the plains, the snow-capped mountains in the distance, the campfire crackling as the gang shares stories and songs, the quiet moments between the violence when Arthur pauses to watch a sunset or sketch a flower in his journal. These moments of beauty exist alongside the brutality, and that's what makes the game feel true. Life in 1899 was hard, but it was also full of wonder. The people who lived through that era saw things we can only imagine. The last of the great buffalo herds, the first automobiles, the transformation of a continent. They lived through history just as we do, often without realizing it. The game invites us to step into their world, to see through their eyes, to feel what they felt. And in doing so, it helps us understand not just the past, but ourselves. The questions Arthur faces are our questions too. What do we owe to others? How do we find meaning in a world that often seems meaningless? Can we change? or are we trapped by our pasts? These are the questions that follow us into sleep, that shape our dreams, that we wake up still pondering. They have no easy answers, but the asking is what makes us human. The ranches scattered across the game's landscape tell stories of hope and hardship. Homesteading was still drawing families westward in 1899, though the best land had long since been claimed. The Homestead Act of 1862 had promised 160 acres to anyone willing to work the land for 5 years, and millions had taken up the offer. But homesteading was brutal work. The land had to be cleared, ploughed, and planted. Houses had to be built from whatever materials were available. Water had to be found and secured, and all of this had to be done while fighting off drought, locusts, disease, and sometimes hostile neighbours. Many homesteaders failed. The land was too dry, the winters too harsh, the isolation too crushing. They abandoned their claims and moved on, leaving behind the empty buildings that dot the game's landscape. These ruins are monuments to broken dreams, reminders that the promise of the West was not always kept. Those who succeeded built communities. They established schools and churches, formed governments, and created the infrastructure of civilization. The ranches in the game that are thriving represent this success, the hard-won victory of persistence over adversity. The cattle industry that dominates places like Valentine was built on this foundation. Ranchers needed vast acreages to graze their herds, and they often came into conflict with homesteaders who fenced off the open range. The range wars of the 1880s and 1890s were sometimes violent, as competing interests fought for control of the land. By 1899, the cattle industry was changing. The open range was giving way to fenced pastures. Railroads had made it possible to ship cattle to market without the long drives that had defined the earlier era. The cowboy, that iconic figure of the American West, was becoming an employee rather than a free-ranging adventurer. The sheep ranchers who appear in the game represent another faction in the struggle for the land. Cattle ranchers despised sheep, claiming they destroyed the grass and fouled the water. The conflict between cattle and sheep interests was real and sometimes deadly. The game captures this tension in its portrayal of competing ranches. The swamps of Lemoyne bring us to a different world entirely, one shaped by the legacy of slavery and the ongoing struggle for civil rights. The region mirrors Louisiana with its French heritage, its plantation history, and its complex racial dynamics. The plantations that appear in the game are relics of the antebellum South, built on the labour of enslaved people. By 1899, slavery had been abolished for more than 30 years, but its effects lingered. The plantation system had been replaced by sharecropping, which kept many black families in a state of economic bondage little better than slavery itself. The Braithwaite and Gray families in the game represent the old Southern aristocracy, clinging to their faded glory and nursing ancient grudges. Their feud mirrors real conflicts between plantation families, disputes over land, honour, and perceived slights that could last for generations. The poverty visible in Lemoyne reflects the economic devastation of the post-Civil War South. The region had been wrecked by the war and had never fully recovered. While the North industrialised and prospered, the South remained largely agricultural and poor. This disparity would persist well into the 20th century. The Ku Klux Klan appears in the game, and their presence is historically accurate. The Klan had been founded in 1865 and had terrorised black communities throughout the South during Reconstruction. It had been suppressed in the 1870s, but would rise again in the early 20th century. In 1899, the clan was dormant but not forgotten, and racial violence remained common. The game allows players to kill clan members without penalty, a choice that reflects modern values rather than historical accuracy. In 1899, attacking the clan would have brought severe consequences in most southern communities. But the game's designers made a moral choice, refusing to treat white supremacists as anything other than villains deserving of punishment. The voodoo and hoodoo traditions visible in Lemoyne reflect the African spiritual practices that survived the Middle Passage and adapted to the New World. These traditions blended African beliefs with Catholicism and Native American practices, creating something uniquely American. The game treats these traditions with respect, presenting them as genuine spiritual practices rather than mere superstition. The island of Guarma, where Arthur finds himself stranded for a portion of the game, represents American imperialism at the turn of the century. The Spanish-American War had just ended in 1898, and the United States was asserting itself as a colonial power. Cuba, which Guarma resembles, had been the focus of the war. American newspapers had whipped up public sentiment with sensational stories of Spanish atrocities, and the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor had provided the pretext for war. The conflict was brief but consequential, ending Spanish colonial rule in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The sugar plantations on Guarma reflect the economic exploitation that characterized colonial rule. Sugar was enormously profitable, but its production required brutal labor. Enslaved people had worked the Caribbean sugar plantations for centuries, and even after emancipation, the conditions for workers remained harsh. The revolutionary fighters Arthur encounters represent the ongoing struggle for independence that characterized much of Latin America in this era. Cuba had been fighting for independence from Spain for decades, and the War of 1898 was just one chapter in a longer story. The revolutionaries' distrust of American intentions was well-founded. The United States would maintain significant control over Cuba for decades to come. The tropical environment of Guarma contrasts sharply with the American West, but it's rendered with the same attention to detail. The flora and fauna are appropriate to the Caribbean, and the architecture reflects Spanish colonial styles. It's a brief interlude in the game, but it expands the world beyond the borders of the United States. The experience of being stranded in a foreign land, caught up in conflicts not of his making, changes Arthur. He sees American power from the outside, sees how it appears to those on the receiving end. It's a perspective that few Americans of 1899 would have had, but it enriches the game's exploration of American identity and values. The mining operations in the game reflect an industry that was central to the development of the American West. Gold, silver, copper and coal drew prospectors and companies to remote regions, creating boom towns that could rise and fall within a few years. The Ansberg mining town in the game captures the grim reality of industrial mining. The work was dangerous, the pay was poor, and the companies had little regard for worker safety or welfare. Mining accidents killed thousands every year, and diseases like black lung shortened the lives of those who survived. Child labour was common in mines. Boys as young as 8 or 9 worked as breaker boys, sorting coal from slate in the processing facilities. The work was monotonous and dangerous, and many children were maimed or killed. Laws restricting child labour existed in some states, but enforcement was lax. The company-town system gave mining companies enormous control over their workers. The company owned the houses, the stores, and often the local government. Workers were paid in scrip that could only be spent at company stores, where prices were inflated. Debt kept workers trapped, unable to leave even when conditions were intolerable. Labour organising was met with violence. The Pinkerton Detective Agency and other private security forces were hired to break strikes and intimidate workers. The Ludlow Massacre of 1914, in which Colorado National Guard troops killed striking miners and their families, was still in the future, but the conditions that led to it were already present in 1899. The environmental destruction caused by mining is visible in the game. Streams run orange with mine runoff. Forests are cleared for timber. The land is scarred by excavation. This destruction was largely unregulated in 1899, and its effects persist today. Abandoned mines continue to pollute waterways more than a century later. The wealth extracted from these mines flowed to distant investors, while the communities that produced it remained poor. This pattern of extraction and exploitation was repeated across the West, as natural resources were converted into fortunes for the few and hardship for the many. As your consciousness begins to blur and sleep reaches out to embrace you, let's return to the gang one last time. These fictional characters carry the weight of real history on their shoulders, and their stories resonate because they're grounded in truth. Dutch van der Linde's philosophy of freedom and resistance to civilization echoes real anarchist and utopian movements of the era. His dream of escaping to a place beyond the reach of law and government was shared by many who felt crushed by the forces of modernization. That the dream was impossible didn't make it less powerful. Arthur. Morgan's journey from loyal enforcer to questioning conscience reflects a universal human experience. We all reach moments when we must examine the beliefs and loyalties that have guided our lives. Sometimes we find them wanting. The courage to change, to admit error, to try to do better, is one of the hardest things a person can do. John Marston's attempt to build a new life represents the hope that the past doesn't have to define the future. He wants to be a husband, a father, a rancher, not an outlaw. The struggle to escape one's history is timeless, and John's partial success and ultimate failure speak to the difficulty of true transformation. The women of the gang, each in her own way, represent the limited choices available to women in 1899 and the ways they navigated those limitations. Some accepted their circumstances, others fought against them. All were shaped by a world that offered them few options and demanded much in return. The gang members who die along the way, Sean, Lenny, Hosea and others, remind us of the cost of the outlaw life. These were not faceless enemies, but people with hopes and fears, with relationships and dreams. Their deaths diminish the gang and foreshadow its ultimate dissolution. The betrayals that tear the gang apart reflect the fragility of trust. Loyalty is easy when times are good. It's tested when times are hard. The gang fails that test, as most groups do when pressure becomes too great. By 1899, the fur trade had declined significantly, but trapping remained a way to earn money in remote areas. The fishing techniques Arthur uses, from simple poles to more elaborate setups, reflect the equipment available in 1899. Fly fishing was already a refined art, with specialised rods, reels and artificial flies. But most fishing was simpler, using bait and basic tackle to catch whatever was biting. The taxidermy that the trapper can perform reflects a Victorian fascination with natural history. Mounted animals, decorated homes and public spaces and skilled taxidermists were in demand. The practice seems strange to modern sensibilities, but it was a way of preserving and displaying the natural world in an era before wildlife documentaries and nature photography. The camp upgrades that hunting provides reflect the communal nature of frontier life. Everyone contributed what they could, and the group's survival depended on each member doing their part. Arthur's hunting feeds the camp just as Pearson's cooking and the women's labour maintain it. The gang is a community, however dysfunctional, and communities require cooperation to survive. The honour system in the game, which tracks Arthur's moral choices and affects how the world responds to him, reflects a real concern of the era. Reputation mattered enormously in frontier communities, where everyone knew everyone else and word travelled fast. A man's word was his bond, and breaking it could have serious consequences. Business deals were often sealed with a handshake, and those who proved untrustworthy found doors closed to them. The informal networks of trust and reputation served as a kind of social credit system, rewarding reliability and punishing dishonesty. But reputation could also be manipulated. Outlaws cultivated fearsome reputations to intimidate potential victims. Businessmen burnished their images while engaging in ruthless practices behind the scenes. The gap between reputation and reality was often wide, and navigating it required skill and judgment. The game's honour system simplifies this complexity, but it captures something true about how moral choices accumulate over time. Arthur becomes the sum of his actions, and the world responds accordingly. High honour brings respect and assistance. Low honour brings fear and hostility. Neither is entirely good or bad. Both have their uses. The strangers who react differently to Arthur based on his honour reflect the way communities assessed newcomers. A well-dressed man with a friendly manner would be welcomed. A rough-looking stranger would be viewed with suspicion. First impressions mattered, and changing them required consistent behaviour over time. The different endings available based on Arthur's honour reflect the game's central theme of redemption. A man who has tried to do good, even imperfectly, earns a different fate than one who has embraced cruelty. The game suggests that our choices matter, that we are not simply products of our circumstances, that we have agency even in a world that often seems determined to crush us. The journal that Arthur keeps throughout the game is one of its most touching features, and it reflects a real practice of the era. Diaries and journals were common, especially among literate people who wanted to record their experiences and thoughts. The sketches Arthur makes in his journal reflect the importance of drawing before photography became widespread. Naturalists, explorers, and ordinary travellers recorded what they saw through sketches, creating visual records of places and things that might otherwise be forgotten. Arthur's artistic talent is unusual for an outlaw, but not impossible. People contain multitudes. The written entries reveal Arthur's inner life in ways that his spoken dialogue cannot. We see his doubts, his regrets, his moments of wonder and despair. The journal humanizes him, showing us the man behind the gunslinger. It's a reminder that even those who live violent lives have rich interior worlds. The journal also serves as a record of the game's events, a narrative thread that ties together the disparate missions and encounters. Reading back through it at the end of the game is a melancholy experience, seeing how far Arthur has come and knowing where his journey ends. Letters were the primary means of long-distance communication in 1899, and the game includes several letter-writing sequences. The formality of the language, The careful penmanship, the time required to compose and send a letter, all reflect a world where communication was slower and more deliberate than today. The newspapers Arthur can read provide context for the game's events and connect them to the wider world. The journalism of 1899 was different from today's, more openly partisan and sensational. Yellow journalism, named for the colour of the cheap paper it was printed on, prioritised excitement over accuracy. The newspapers in the game capture this style, with their breathless headlines and dramatic prose. The side activities available in the game, from poker to dominoes to five-finger fillet, reflect the pastimes of frontier life. Entertainment was simpler then, and people made their own fun with whatever was available. Card games were ubiquitous. Poker, blackjack and faro were played in saloons, on river boats, and around campfires. Gambling was technically illegal in many places, but the laws were rarely enforced. Professional gamblers travelled from town to town, and cheating was so common that honest games were the exception. Dominoes had been popular for centuries and remained so in 1899. The game required only a set of tiles, which could be carried easily and played anywhere. It was especially popular in the South and among Hispanic communities. Five-finger fillet, the knife game where players stab between their spread fingers as quickly as possible, was a test of nerve and coordination. It was dangerous and often resulted in injury, but that was part of the appeal. Young men proved their courage by risking their fingers. Horseshoes was a common pastime, requiring only a few metal shoes and a stake in the ground. It could be played casually or competitively, and tournaments drew crowds in some communities. The theatre performances in Saint-Denis reflect the entertainment available in larger cities. Vaudeville shows, plays and musical performances drew audiences hungry for culture and distraction. The acts ranged from highbrow to lowbrow, from Shakespeare to slapstick, often on the same bill. The street performers Arthur encounters, from musicians to magicians to fire eaters, reflect the informal entertainment economy of the era. These performers worked for tips, moving from town to town, bringing wonder and amusement to communities that had few other diversions. The robberies and heists that drive the game's plot reflect the reality of outlaw life in 1899. Bank robberies, train robberies, and stagecoach hold-ups were the bread and butter of criminal gangs, though they were becoming increasingly difficult as security improved. Banks were tempting targets because they held large amounts of cash in one place, but they were also increasingly well protected, with vaults, guards and alarm systems. The days when a gang could simply walk in and demand money at gunpoint were ending. Successful bank robberies required planning, inside information and often violence. Train robberies had been romanticised by dime novels and newspapers, but they were dangerous and often unsuccessful. Trains carried armed guards, and the railroad companies hired detectives to pursue robbers relentlessly. The Wild Bunch's train robberies in the late 1890s were among the last successful ones. By the early 1900s, improved security had made the practice nearly impossible. Stagecoach robbery was already an anachronism by 1899. The railroads had largely replaced stagecoaches for long-distance travel, and the remaining routes carried little of value. The romantic image of the masked highwayman stopping a coach on a lonely road belonged to an earlier era. The game's heists are more elaborate than most real robberies of the period, but they capture the essential elements: the planning, the tension, the things that go wrong, the desperate escape. The Vanderlinde gang's increasingly ambitious and desperate schemes mirror the trajectory of real outlaw gangs, who often escalated their crimes as pressure mounted and options narrowed. The consequences of these crimes, the bounties, the pursuit by lawmen, the need to constantly move, reflect the reality that crime didn't pay in the long run. Most outlaws ended up dead or in prison. The few who escaped, like Butch Cassidy fleeing to South America, did so by abandoning everything they knew and starting over in a foreign land. As sleep finally begins to claim you, let your mind rest on the beauty of the world the game creates. Beyond all the historical accuracy, beyond the careful research and authentic details, there is something more. A sense of wonder at the natural world that existed in 1899 and in diminished form still exists today. The sunrises and sunsets that paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The storms that roll across the plains, lightning flickering in the distance. The fog that settles in the valleys, muffling sound and softening edges. The snow that blankets the mountains, transforming the landscape into something pristine and silent. The forests where light filters through the canopy, dappling the ground with shifting patterns. The rivers that wind through the land, their waters reflecting the sky. The deserts where the heat shimmers and the horizon seems to stretch forever. The swamps where cypress trees rise from dark water and strange sounds echo in the night. This is the world that existed before highways and strip malls, before the constant hum of electricity and the glow of screens. It was a world where darkness was truly dark and silence was truly silent, where the stars blazed overhead in numbers we can barely imagine today, where the natural world was not something to visit on weekends, but the constant backdrop of daily life. The game invites us to experience that world, to slow down and notice the details that our ancestors took for granted. The way light changes through the day, the sounds of different environments, the behavior of animals going about their lives, the rhythm of nature that underlies all human activity. In our busy modern lives, we rarely have time to notice these things, but in the game, we can pause, we can watch, we can listen, we can remember or imagine what it was like to live in a world where nature was not separate from human life but woven through it. This is perhaps the game's greatest gift, not just historical accuracy, but a reminder of what we've lost, and what, in some measure, we might still find if we take the time to look. The crafting system in the game reflects the self-sufficiency that frontier life demanded. People made what they needed from what they had, and the skills of crafting were passed down through generations. Leatherworking was essential. Saddles, holsters, belts, and boots all required skilled craftsmen who could turn animal hides into durable goods. The tanning process was smelly and labour-intensive, but the results could last for decades. The leather goods Arthur can craft or purchase reflect this tradition. Blacksmithing was equally important. Every town needed a blacksmith to shoe horses, repair tools, and forge new implements. The forge was often the heart of a community, a place where people gathered to wait for their work and exchange news. The blacksmiths in the game's towns represent this essential trade. Gunsmithing was a specialised skill, and gunsmiths were valued members of frontier communities. They repaired weapons, customised them to individual preferences, and sometimes built them from scratch. The gun shops in the game offer services that real gunsmiths would have provided. Cooking was a daily necessity, and the recipes Arthur can prepare reflect the foods available in 1899. Stews and roasts made from game meat, beans and bread, coffee brewed over an open fire. The cooking was simple but sustaining. designed to provide energy for hard physical labour. The tonics and medicines Arthur can craft reflect the folk remedies that people relied on before modern pharmaceuticals. Some were effective, many were not. But in the absence of doctors and drugstores, people did what they could with the plants and materials available to them. The camp itself requires maintenance and supplies, reflecting the constant work required to sustain a community. Firewood must be gathered, food must be prepared, equipment must be maintained. The gang members who complain about chores are expressing a universal human sentiment, but the work is necessary for survival. The stranger missions scattered throughout the game introduce characters and situations that expand the world beyond the main story. Many of these are based on real types of people and events from 1899. The inventor who asks Arthur to help test his flying machine reflects the spirit of innovation that characterized the era. The Wright brothers were not alone in their quest for flight. Dozens of inventors were experimenting with various designs. Most failed, but their efforts contributed to the eventual success. The paleontologist searching for dinosaur bones reflects the scientific excitement of the late 19th century. Dinosaur fossils had been discovered in the American West, and the bone wars between rival paleontologists had captured public imagination. The science of paleontology was young, but growing rapidly. The wildlife photographer trying to capture images of rare animals reflects the growing interest in natural history and conservation. Photography was making it possible to document the natural world in ways that had never been possible before, and some photographers were already advocating for the protection of endangered species. The circus performers and sideshow attractions reflect the entertainment industry of the era. Circuses travelled the country, bringing exotic animals and unusual performers to communities that had few other diversions. The ethics of these shows were questionable, but they were enormously popular. The treasure hunters searching for buried gold reflect the persistent legends of lost mines and hidden fortunes that circulated throughout the West. Some of these legends were based on real events. Most were pure fantasy, but the dream of finding buried treasure motivated many a fruitless search. The bounty hunting missions reflect the real system of rewards for capturing criminals. Bounty hunters operated in a legal grey area, with no official authority but tacit permission to pursue wanted men. The work was dangerous and morally ambiguous, but it paid well for those who were good at it. The duels that Arthur can engage in reflect a practice that was already becoming rare by 1899 but had not entirely disappeared. The formal duel, with its rituals and rules, was largely a thing of the past. But confrontations between armed men still occurred, and the quick draw was a skill that could mean the difference between life and death. The mythology of the quick draw gunfighter was largely created after the fact, by dime novels, and later by movies. Real gunfights were often messy, chaotic affairs, nothing like the stylized showdowns as popular imagination. But the image persisted, and some men cultivated reputations as fast draws. Wild Bill Hickok, who had died in 1876, was already a legend by 1899. His exploits, real and imagined, had been celebrated in newspapers and novels. He represented an ideal of the Western gunfighter that would influence popular culture for generations. The reality was more complex. Most gunfights were not fair fights between equals. They were ambushes, assassinations, or drunken brawls. The men who survived were often those who were willing to shoot first and ask questions later, not those who waited for their opponent to draw. The game captures both the mythology and the reality. The formal duels are stylized and dramatic, but the random encounters often devolve into chaotic violence. Arthur can be a noble gunfighter or a ruthless killer, depending on the player's choices. Both options were available to real men in 1899. The weapons Arthur carries would have made him formidable by the standards of the time. Multiple revolvers, a rifle, a shotgun, and various other arms gave him firepower that few individuals could match. But carrying so many weapons was unusual. Most people made do with a single pistol or rifle, if they were armed at all. The bathhouses that Arthur can visit in the game's towns reflect the challenges of personal hygiene in 1899. Running water was not universal, and hot water required heating on a stove. Public bathhouses provided a service that many people couldn't easily replicate at home. The option to have an attendant assist with the bath reflects a real service that was available in some establishments. It was not necessarily sexual, though it could be. Mostly it was a luxury for those who could afford to have someone else do the scrubbing. Personal grooming was important even on the frontier. Barbershops offered haircuts, shaves, and sometimes dental services. A clean shave and a neat haircut signalled respectability, while a wild beard and unkempt hair suggested a man who had been too long in the wilderness. The clothing stores in the game offer a range of options that reflect the variety available in 1899. Ready-made clothing was becoming more common, though custom tailoring was still preferred by those who could afford it. The catalogues of companies like Sears and Montgomery Ward made fashionable clothing available even in remote areas. The general stores that appear in every town were the lifeline of frontier communities. They stocked everything from food to ammunition to farm equipment. The storekeeper was often one of the most important people in town, extending credit to farmers and ranchers and serving as an informal banker. The post offices in the game reflect the importance of mail service in connecting isolated communities to the wider world. The Postal Service was one of the few federal institutions that touched the lives of ordinary people, and the arrival of the mail was an event in small towns. The hotels and boarding houses offered lodging to travellers and temporary residents. The quality varied enormously, from luxurious establishments in cities to rough frontier accommodations where guests might share beds with strangers. The hotels in the game reflect this range. The doctors in the game's towns represent a profession that was undergoing significant changes in 1899. The funerals in the game reflect the rituals that helped people cope with loss, the gathering of community, the words spoken over the grave, the slow procession to the cemetery. These rituals provided structure and meaning in the face of death's randomness. The gang's losses throughout the game carry this weight. When Sean dies, when Lenny dies, when Hosea dies, the grief is real because the characters are real. The game doesn't treat death as trivial, even though Arthur kills many people throughout his journey. There's a difference between the anonymous enemies and the people we've come to know. Arthur's own death, when it comes, is treated with the gravity it deserves. His struggle with tuberculosis, his gradual weakening, his final confrontation, all are portrayed with honesty and compassion. The game doesn't offer false hope or easy redemption. It offers only the truth that death comes for everyone, and that how we face it matters. This is perhaps the most historically accurate thing about the game. Its acknowledgement that life in 1899 was fragile, that death was always close, and that people found ways to live meaningfully despite this knowledge. They loved, they worked, they dreamed, they fought, knowing that it could all end at any moment. And somehow, that knowledge made life more precious, not less. Now let your mind release these thoughts. Let them drift away like leaves on a slow river. The history we've explored tonight is real, but it's also past. The people who lived through 1899 are gone now. Their struggles and triumphs faded into memory. But something of them remains in the stories we tell, in the games we play, in the quiet moments when we imagine what their lives were like. The Old West was not a simple place. It was not the black and white world of old movies where good guys wore white hats and bad guys wore black. It was a place of complexity and contradiction, where heroes could be villains and villains could be heroes, where progress came at terrible cost, and tradition offered no protection against change. The game captures this complexity. It doesn't offer easy answers or simple morals. It presents a world and lets us explore it, make choices, face consequences. It trusts us to find meaning in the chaos, just as the people of 1899 had to find meaning in theirs. And now, as sleep finally claims you, carry with you the image of that world one last time. The vast sky stretching from horizon to horizon. The mountains rising in the distance, snow-capped and eternal. The plains rolling endlessly, grass rippling in the wind like waves on a golden sea. The forest dark and deep, full of mystery and danger. The rivers winding through the land, carrying water from the mountains to the sea. This is the world that was. This is the world that the game recreates with such care and attention. This is the world that exists now only in memory and imagination, in photographs and paintings, in stories and songs, in the digital landscapes of a video game that somehow captures something true about a time and place that are gone forever. Sleep now. Dream of open spaces and endless possibilities. Dream of a world before the modern age, when the frontier still beckoned and the future was unwritten. Dream of cowboys and outlaws, of lawmen and settlers, of all the people who lived and died in the dying days of the Old West. And when you wake, carry something of that world with you. The sense of wonder at the natural world, the appreciation for the struggles of those who came before, the understanding that history is not just dates and facts, but the lived experience of real people facing real challenges. The Old West is gone, but it lives on in our imagination. And tonight, as you drift into sleep, it lives in you. The stagecoach lines that still operated in 1899 were relics of an earlier era, but they served communities that the railroads hadn't reached. The coaches were uncomfortable, the journeys long, and the roads often treacherous. But for people in remote areas, they were the only connection to the wider world. The game includes stagecoaches as both transportation and targets for robbery. The coaches themselves are accurately depicted, with their distinctive designs and the teams of horses that pulled them. The drivers and guards who protected them were often armed and experienced, making robbery a risky proposition. The ferry services that cross the game's rivers reflect another form of transportation that was essential before bridges were built. Ferries had operated on American rivers since colonial times, and they remained important in 1899. The ferrymen who operated them were often colourful characters, full of stories about the people and goods they had carried. The bridges in the game range from simple wooden structures to more elaborate iron constructions. Bridge building was advancing rapidly in the late 19th century, with new materials and techniques making longer spans possible. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, had demonstrated what was possible, and bridges were transforming transportation across the country. The roads themselves varied enormously in quality. In cities, Some streets were paved with cobblestones or brick. In rural areas, roads were often little more than dirt tracks, impassable in wet weather. The Good Roads movement was advocating for improvements, but progress was slow. The automobile age would eventually transform American roads, but in 1899 most were still designed for horses and wagons. The telegraph lines that stretch across the landscape represent the communication revolution of the 19th century. The telegraph had made instant long-distance communication possible for the first time in human history. News that once took weeks to travel could now be transmitted in minutes. The world was shrinking, and the isolation of the frontier was ending. The oil industry that Leviticus Cornwall represents was transforming America in 1899. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled most of the nation's oil production and refining, making him one of the richest men in history. Oil was used primarily for kerosene lamps, but the automobile age would soon create an insatiable demand for gasoline. The drilling rigs and oil derricks that appear in the game reflect the technology of the time. Oil was extracted using cable tool drilling, a method that had been used since ancient times. The rotary drilling that would revolutionize the industry was just being developed. The environmental destruction caused by oil extraction was already visible, with spills and fires common occurrences. The lumber industry was equally important and equally destructive. The forests of the American West were being cut at an unsustainable rate, providing timber for construction, railroad ties, and fuel. The clear-cutting visible in some areas of the game reflects this reality. Conservation efforts were beginning, but they faced powerful opposition from industry. The cattle industry that dominates the game's economy was changing rapidly. The open range was giving way to fenced pastures, and the long cattle drives were becoming rare. Refrigerated railroad cars made it possible to ship dressed beef rather than live cattle, changing the economics of the industry. The cowboys who had driven herds north were becoming ranch hands, their freedom curtailed by fences and employers. The mining industry continued to extract wealth from the earth, but the easy pickings were gone. The gold and silver that could be panned from streams had been exhausted. Now mining required heavy equipment and significant capital. The individual prospector was giving way to the mining corporation, and the romance of the gold rush was fading into memory. These industries were building modern America, but they were also destroying the Old West. The wilderness was being tamed, the resources extracted, the land transformed. The world the van der Linde gang knew was disappearing, replaced by something more orderly but less free. The conservation movement was just beginning to gain strength in 1899. Theodore Roosevelt, who had become president in 1901, was already an advocate for preserving wild spaces. The first national parks had been established, including Yellowstone in 1872, and more would follow in the coming decades. The game includes wilderness areas that feel untouched by human activity, and these reflect the wild spaces that conservationists were fighting to protect. The forests, mountains, and plains that Arthur explores would have been familiar to the naturalists and hunters, who are beginning to realize that these places might not last forever. John Muir, the famous naturalist, was actively campaigning for conservation in 1899. His writings about the Sierra Nevada and other wild places were inspiring a new appreciation for nature. The Sierra Club, which he had founded in 1892, was advocating for the protection of wilderness areas. The tension between development and conservation runs through the game, though it's not always explicit. The logging operations, the mining camps, the expanding towns all represent the forces that were transforming the landscape. The wild animals that Arthur hunts were already becoming rare in many areas, pushed out by human activity. The game's hunting mechanics include a conservation message, though it's subtle. Overhunting depletes animal populations, and some species are already rare. The legendary animals that Arthur pursues are the last of their kind, survivors in a world that has little room for them. This tension between progress and preservation would define American environmental policy for the next century. The national parks, the wilderness areas, the endangered species protections all grew from the conservation movement that was taking shape in 1899. The wild spaces that the game depicts would be fought over, some preserved and some lost, in the decades to come. The immigrant communities in the game reflect the diversity of 1899 America. The great wave of immigration from southern and eastern Europe was at its peak, bringing millions of Italians, Poles, Russians and others to American shores. They joined earlier immigrants from Ireland, Germany and Scandinavia, creating a patchwork of ethnic communities. These immigrants faced discrimination and exploitation. They were blamed for crime, disease and unemployment. Nativist movements sought to restrict immigration, and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had already barred one group entirely. But the immigrants kept coming, drawn by the promise of opportunity and freedom. The game includes characters from various immigrant backgrounds, reflecting this diversity. The accents, the names, the cultural references all suggest the mixing of peoples that was transforming America. Saint Denis, with its French heritage and diverse population, is particularly rich in immigrant characters. The assimilation process was often painful. Immigrants were pressured to abandon their languages and customs, to become American as quickly as possible. Children were caught between the old world of their parents and the new world of their peers. The tension between tradition and adaptation was a constant theme in immigrant communities. But immigrants also transformed America. They brought their foods, their music, their traditions, enriching American culture in ways that are still visible today. The pizza and pasta, the polka and the waltz, the Christmas trees and the Easter eggs all came from immigrant communities. America was being remade by the people who came seeking a better life. The game captures this transformation in small ways: the ethnic restaurants in St. Denis, the foreign languages heard on the streets, the cultural festivals and traditions. It's a reminder that America has always been a nation of immigrants, constantly changing as new people arrive and add their contributions to the mix. The education system of 1899 was expanding but still limited. Public schools were becoming more common, but attendance was not universal. Many children, especially in rural areas, received little formal education. Those who did attend often left after a few years to work on farms or in factories. The one-room schoolhouses that appear in the game reflect the reality of rural education. A single teacher taught students of all ages, using whatever materials were available. The curriculum focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic, with some attention to history and geography. Discipline was strict, and corporal punishment was common. Higher education was available to a small elite. Colleges and universities were expanding, but they remained inaccessible to most Americans. Women were beginning to gain access to higher education, but they faced significant barriers. African Americans were largely excluded from white institutions and relied on historically black colleges. Literacy rates were rising, but still far from universal. The ability to read and write was increasingly important in an industrializing economy, and those who lacked these skills were at a significant disadvantage. Newspapers, books, and magazines were becoming more widely available, spreading information and ideas to a growing audience. The game includes references to education and literacy. Arthur's journal demonstrates his ability to read and write, skills that not all outlaws would have possessed. The newspapers he reads, the books he can purchase, the letters he receives, all reflect a world where literacy was becoming essential. The libraries that were being established in cities and towns represented a democratization of knowledge. Andrew Carnegie was funding library construction across the country, making books available to people who could never have afforded to buy them. These libraries were temples of learning, offering opportunity to anyone willing to walk through their doors. The political landscape of 1899 was turbulent and contentious. The two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, competed for power, but neither fully represented the interests of ordinary Americans. Third parties, including the populists and later the progressives, challenged the established order. The populist movement had peaked in the 1890s, representing farmers and workers who felt exploited by banks, railroads, and corporations. Their demands for reform, including a graduated income tax, direct election of senators, and regulation of monopolies, would eventually be adopted. But in 1899 they were still fighting against powerful interests. Corruption was endemic in American politics. Political machines controlled cities, dispensing jobs and favours in exchange for votes. Corporations bought politicians and wrote legislation to benefit themselves. The gap between democratic ideals and political reality was wide and growing. The game touches on political corruption through characters like the mayor of St. Denis and the various businessmen who use their wealth to influence government. The cynicism about politics that many characters express reflects a genuine sentiment of the era. Many Americans had lost faith in the political system and saw it as rigged against ordinary people. The reform movements that would define the progressive era were gathering strength. Muckraking journalists were exposing corruption and abuse. Social reformers were advocating for labour laws, food safety regulations, and political reforms. The changes they sought would come in the early 20th century, transforming American government and society. The game is set at a moment of transition, when the old order was crumbling but the new order had not yet emerged. The characters are caught in this transition, unable to go back to the past but uncertain about the future. It's a feeling that resonates across time, as every generation faces its own moments of change and uncertainty. And now, as the final threads of consciousness begin to unravel and sleep reaches up to claim you, let these images settle into your mind like snow falling on a quiet landscape. Picture the campfire burning low, the embers glowing orange against the darkness. The gang gathered around, their faces lit by the flickering light. Someone is playing a guitar, the notes drifting up into the star-filled sky. Voices join in song, rough and untrained but full of feeling. For this moment at least, they are together. They are family. Picture Arthur riding alone across the plains as the sun sets behind him. His horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the earth. The sky blazes with colour, orange and pink and purple, fading to deep blue at the edges. He doesn't know where he's going, not really, but the riding itself is enough. The movement, the freedom, the vast empty space stretching out in every direction. Picture the mountains in the distance, their peaks white with snow. They've been there for millions of years and will be there for millions more. The human dramas playing out in their shadow are brief flickers, here and gone in an instant of geological time. And yet those dramas matter to the people living them, to us watching from across the years. Picture the small moments that make up a life. A cup of coffee in the morning, steam rising in the cold air, a conversation with a friend, words exchanged that will be forgotten but feelings that will linger, a sunset watched in silence, beauty observed and appreciated, a kindness offered to a stranger, a debt repaid, a wrong made right. These are the things that matter in 1899 and today. Not the grand events that make it into history books, but the small human moments that fill our days. The game understands this, and that's why it resonates. It's not just about outlaws and gunfights. It's about people trying to live, trying to find meaning, trying to connect with each other in a world that often seems indifferent to their struggles. Sleep now. Let the world of 1899 fade into dreams. Let Arthur and Dutch and John and all the others rest, their stories told, their journeys complete. They existed only in imagination, but they felt real, and that's what matters. They showed us something true about human nature, about history, about ourselves. And tomorrow, when you wake, the world will still be here, changed and changing, full of its own struggles and beauties. But tonight, for these few hours, let it all go. Let sleep carry you away to wherever dreams take you. The Old West will be waiting when you return, preserved in memory and imagination, a world that never was but somehow always will be. Good night, partner. Rest well. The trail will be there in the morning.